June 28, 1943. Tha Sao Camp, 147 kilometers north of Kanchanaburi, Thailand. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Toosey of the 135th Field Regiment, Royal Artillery, stands in pre-dawn darkness, watching the jungle consume men. His hands grip the bamboo rail of the bridge he has been forced to build, feeling the structure sway under its own weight. The monsoon rain hammers down at 8 inches per day, turning the Nam Mae Kwa Valley into a brown torrent that rises 4 feet hourly. Below him, Japanese engineers are driving slave labor crews at gunpoint to complete a wooden trestle span before the river washes away 3 months of work. Toosey knows the mathematics with brutal clarity. The Japanese need this railway operational by October 1943 to supply their Burma operations. They have 250 miles of track to complete through mountainous jungle terrain. They started with 61,000 Allied prisoners of war and 270,000 Asian laborers. In the last 6 months, 12,000 men have died. The completion rate stands at 1.2 miles per day when they need 2.3 miles to meet the deadline. The bridge beneath his feet, declared finished yesterday, already shows stress fractures in the support timbers. It will carry 1 locomotive, maximum speed 15 miles per hour, before requiring complete reconstruction. This railway, built with such terrible human cost, will never solve Japan's logistics crisis. Toosey has done the calculations himself. Even if every bridge holds, even if the track doesn't wash away in the next monsoon, even if locomotives and rolling stock materialize from Japan's non-existent surplus, the railway can move perhaps 1,000 tons per day. Japan's Burma campaign requires 10,000 tons daily to maintain offensive operations. The mathematics of industrial warfare have already determined the outcome. What neither Toosey nor his captors know is that this railway, which will kill over 100,000 people in its construction, represents not Japanese engineering prowess, but the catastrophic logistics failure of an island nation attempting continental warfare without continental infrastructure. The Japanese strategic delusion began in December 1941, not with Pearl Harbor's tactical success, but with the assumption that territorial conquest would solve Japan's fundamental resource problems. Imperial General Headquarters planning documents, recovered after the war from the National Institute for Defense Studies archives, reveal a logistics strategy based on systematic underestimation of distances, transportation requirements, and the corrosive effects of tropical climate on infrastructure. The Burma campaign illustrates this delusion perfectly. British Burma, occupied by Japanese forces between January and May 1942, possessed the Yenangyang oil fields producing 3,000 barrels daily, rice paddies supporting local populations, and theoretical access to India for further conquests. Japanese planners calculated that Burma could be supplied through 3 routes. First, by sea through Rangoon port, moving cargo 1,200 miles from Singapore. Second, by air from Thailand using transport aircraft. Third, overland through China from the railhead at Lashio. The planning documents estimated monthly supply requirements for the Burma Area Army at 30,000 tons, including food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. This calculation assumed static defensive operations with minimal combat expenditure. It was wrong by a factor of 3. Lieutenant General Shojiro Ida, commanding Japanese forces in Burma, discovered the logistics reality within weeks of completing the conquest. Allied submarine warfare made Rangoon supply routes suicidal. The submarine USS Grenadier alone sank 7 Japanese cargo vessels in the Bay of Bengal during 1942, representing 28,000 tons of shipping that never reached Burma. Japanese Navy escort capability, already insufficient for Pacific operations, could not protect additional convoys to Burma. Air transport proved equally futile. Japanese cargo aircraft, primarily Mitsubishi Ki-57 and Kawasaki Ki-56 transports based on civilian designs, carried maximum 2.5 tons per aircraft. To deliver 30,000 tons monthly required 12,000 aircraft sorties. assuming perfect serviceability and no losses. Japan possessed approximately 150 suitable transport aircraft total, operating across the entire Pacific theatre. Even dedicating the entire fleet to Burma, which was impossible, would deliver barely 5,000 tons monthly. The China overland route existed only on maps. The Burma Road, built by 200,000 Chinese labourers between 1937 and 1938 as a supply route to nationalist China, required constant maintenance British and Chinese engineering units had provided. Japanese occupation forces lacked the personnel, equipment, and expertise to maintain it. Monsoon rains that averaged 200 inches annually in northern Burma washed out sections faster than Japanese engineers could repair them. By September 1942, the overland route existed only in theoretical reports to Tokyo. The railway concept emerged from this logistics desperation. Lieutenant General Tsuneyoshi Takashina, Chief of Staff for Southern Army, proposed in June 1942 to connect Thailand's existing railway network to Burma's system, creating a protected overland supply route immune to submarine attack and independent of air transport. The proposal reached Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who approved it immediately, despite objections from engineering officers who understood the technical impossibility. The target route would span 250 miles from Thanbusayat in Burma to Nong Pladuk in Thailand, connecting to Bangkok's rail system and ultimately to Singapore. It would cross 6 mountain ranges with peaks exceeding 1,000 feet, ford 32 permanent rivers and hundreds of monsoon streams, traverse dense primary rainforest where visibility dropped to 10 yards and operate in a climate alternating between 110-degree heat and torrential monsoons dumping 40 inches of rain monthly. British colonial engineers had surveyed the route in the 1890s and concluded that construction was technically feasible, but economically insane. Their estimate assumed modern equipment, a skilled workforce, a 5-year construction timeline, an unlimited budget. Japanese planners allocated 18 months, no modern equipment, and a workforce of enslaved prisoners. Colonel Yoshitada Nagatomo, chief railway engineer for the Burma-Siam Railway project, understood the mathematical reality but could not speak it. His preliminary engineering survey, completed in July 1942, calculated that earthwork alone required moving 3 million cubic meters of soil and rock. With modern excavators and bulldozers, this represented 18 months of work. With hand tools wielded by malnourished prisoners, it represented an impossibility. The survey noted that monsoon conditions would make construction impossible from June through September. That Japanese forces in Burma would collapse from supply starvation before the railway could be completed. That the proposed route crossed terrain so difficult that maintenance requirements would exceed original construction costs within 2 years. The survey's conclusion, transmitted to Southern Army headquarters in September 1942, recommended abandoning the project and concentrating on improving Rangoon port defences. Tokyo rejected the recommendation. The decision was political, not engineering. Admitting the railway's impossibility meant admitting Burma's strategic untenable position, which meant admitting that Japan's entire southern strategy was failing. Instead, headquarters simply changed the deadline from 18 months to 12 months and ordered construction to begin immediately. On June 16, 1942, the first prisoners arrived at Thanbusayat base camp. Lieutenant Hiroshi Abe, responsible for prisoner allocation, recorded in his diary the workforce composition. Approximately 61,000 Allied prisoners of war, primarily British, Australian, Dutch, and American, captured during the Malaya and East Indies campaigns. Approximately 270,000 Asian labourers, called Romusha, recruited, which meant forcibly conscripted, from Malaya, Burma, Thailand, and the Dutch East Indies. The term recruited appears in official Japanese documents, but captured logistics records show that most Romusha were simply rounded up by military police and transported to construction sites without consent, payment, or provisions for return. The prisoners discovered immediately that Japanese planning existed only on paper. There were no prepared camps, no medical facilities, no kitchens, no latrines, no water supply beyond what could be drawn from rivers. Rations consisted of rice calculated at 300 grams per prisoner daily, 1/3 of minimum caloric requirements for men performing heavy labour in tropical heat. There were no vegetables, no protein, no salt replacement for sweat losses exceeding 2 litres daily. Tools consisted of chunk saws, heavy bamboo baskets for carrying earth, parangs, machetes for clearing jungle, and picks and shovels manufactured in 1905 for Japanese railway construction in Manchuria and shipped south despite being worn beyond serviceability. There was no modern earth-moving equipment, no bulldozers, no excavators, no mechanized drills for rock work, no concrete mixers for bridge foundations. The Japanese army operating on resources that America allocated to a single engineer battalion possessed neither the equipment nor the industrial capacity to provide it. Medical supplies consisted of bandages and iodine, no antimalarials, no antibiotics, which didn't yet exist, no surgical equipment beyond basic amputation tools, no anesthetics. Camp hospitals were bamboo huts with dirt floors where men died from treatable infections because there was nothing to treat them with. The engineering challenge exceeded anything attempted in modern military history. The route required cutting through primary rainforest so dense that progress was measured in yards per day rather than miles. Trees reached 200 feet high with root systems extending 30 feet across. Clearing required cutting every tree individually, digging out roots, then burning or hauling away debris. A work gang of 50 men using hand tools advanced approximately 100 yards daily through forest, assuming good conditions and no deaths. Earthwork demands varied from simple grading in flat terrain to massive cuts through hillsides, requiring removal of thousands of cubic yards of rock and soil. The Konyu cutting, 75 kilometers north of Kanchanaburi, required removing 72,000 cubic meters of rock from a hillside to create a level roadbed. Using hand tools, this represented approximately 180,000 man-days of labor. Japanese engineers allocated 65 days and 5,000 prisoners. The mathematics made completion impossible, so they simply worked prisoners until they died, then brought in more. Bridge construction represented the railway's most visible engineering challenge and its most complete failure. The route crossed 688 bridges and trestles, ranging from small culverts over streams to major spans exceeding 300 meters. Each bridge required foundations, typically pile-driven timber sunk 15 to 20 feet into riverbed mud, superstructure of timber trusses, and deck strong enough to support a locomotive weighing 80 tons at slow speed. The bridge at Thamai Kam, known to prisoners as the bridge on the River Kwai, though the film of that name was fictionalized, represented typical construction. The span measured 300 meters across the Mae Klong River, requiring 11 spans supported by 10 pier assemblies. Each pier required 24 timber piles driven to refusal, approximately 20 feet into the riverbed. The piles were teak logs 14 inches in diameter and 30 feet long, driven using a primitive pile driver consisting of a 2,000-pound iron weight dropped from a 30-foot tower. Each pile required 200 to 300 strikes to reach proper depth, with each strike powered by 30 men pulling ropes to lift the weight. Pile driving operations ran 18 hours daily, with prisoners dying regularly from exhaustion, falls from scaffolding, or crushing injuries when pile drivers malfunctioned. The bridge's superstructure used dimensional timber cut from local teak forests and transported to the site by prisoner work gangs, carrying logs weighing 500 pounds across muddy terrain, lacking roads. Assembly required precise joinery, which was impossible with hand tools and exhausted workers, so joints were simply lashed with wire and hoped to hold. The completed bridge, finished in February 1943, 6 weeks behind schedule after killing 107 prisoners, and an estimated 400 ramusha during construction, was immediately declared inadequate. The timber foundation piles had been driven insufficiently deep because the work gangs lacked strength to operate pile drivers effectively. The superstructure showed stress fractures in every truss because green timber had been used without proper curing. The deck could not support standard locomotive weight at normal operating speeds. Maximum safe speed was determined to be 8 miles per hour, which meant supply trains would require 30 hours to traverse the entire route, rather than the planned 12 hours. The bridge was partially destroyed by Allied bombing in 1945, rebuilt by Japanese engineers using forced labour, bombed again, rebuilt again, then finally abandoned. Today's bridge at Kanchanaburi, a tourist attraction, is a post-war reconstruction that bears little resemblance to the original structure. Every bridge along the railway followed similar patterns: insufficient foundations, inadequate materials, incompetent construction, followed by constant reconstruction that consumed as many man-hours as original building. Japanese engineering doctrine assumed that bridges, once built, would remain serviceable with minimal maintenance. The Burma Railway demonstrated that wooden bridges in monsoon climate required complete reconstruction every 6 months. The Japanese never allocated resources for this maintenance, so bridges simply collapsed under train loads, killing crews and destroying cargo. The human cost of construction exceeded any engineering project in modern history. Medical records maintained by Allied medical officers, primarily Australian and British doctors working in prison camps, provide comprehensive mortality data, later compiled by the Australian War Memorial and the Imperial War Museum. Between June 1942 and October 1943, the 16-month construction period, approximately 12,621 Allied prisoners of war died from disease, malnutrition, overwork, and direct violence. The death rate reached 21% of total Allied prisoner population, the highest mortality rate for any prisoner group in the Pacific Theatre. Causes of death, documented in camp medical logs, included cholera, which killed through dehydration in 24 to 48 hours, spreading through camps via contaminated water supplies. Japanese guards refused to implement basic sanitation procedures, forcing prisoners to drink from rivers used for defecation and waste disposal. Malaria, transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes, breeding in standing water throughout the jungle. Without quinine or any anti-malarial drugs, cases progressed to cerebral malaria and death. Camp medical officers estimated 80% of prisoners contracted malaria during construction. Dysentery, both bacterial and amoebic, causing chronic diarrhea that progressed to fatal dehydration and organ failure. Tropical ulcers, skin infections that penetrated to bone, requiring amputation without anesthesia to prevent fatal septicemia. Beriberi, caused by vitamin B deficiency in rice-only diet, leading to heart failure and paralysis. Pellagra, from niacin deficiency, causing dementia before death. Cholera epidemics swept camps 3 times during construction in October 1942, May 1943, and August 1943. The May outbreak at Hintook Mountain Camp killed 130 men in 10 days. Camp Medical Officer Lieutenant Colonel Albert Coates recorded the progression. Men would be working at dawn, complain of stomach cramps by noon, collapse with violent diarrhea and vomiting by afternoon, and be dead by the following morning. We had no treatment beyond oral rehydration, which was ineffective in severe cases. Bodies were burned in mass pyres because the ground was too rocky for burial, and leaving corpses risked spreading infection further. Japanese guards viewed the deaths with indifference or satisfaction, depending on their disposition. Sergeant Katsuo Nakamura, guarding prisoners at Takanun Camp, wrote in his diary recovered after the war, 10 prisoners died today from disease. This is acceptable as it reduces food requirements without reducing work output. Replacement prisoners will arrive from Singapore next week. The casual calculation of human life as a logistics variable appears repeatedly in Japanese records. The ramusha, Asian civilian labourers suffered even worse. Precise mortality figures remain unknown because Japanese forces maintained no records of Ramusha deaths and few survivors remained to provide testimony. Post-war tribunals estimated 90,000 to 100,000 Ramusha died during railway construction, representing a mortality rate exceeding 30%. The higher death rate stemmed from worse treatment than Allied prisoners received. Ramusha received smaller food rations, approximately 200 grams of rice daily, compared to prisoners' 300 grams. They had no medical care whatsoever, while Allied prisoners at least had captured doctors providing minimal treatment. They were housed in the most primitive conditions, often simply sleeping on the ground without shelter. They were considered expendable in ways that Allied prisoners, who had propaganda value and were theoretically protected by Geneva Convention obligations Japan had signed but never ratified, were not. Ramusha, who became too ill to work, were abandoned at work sites, left to die without food or water. Bodies were not recovered or counted. The jungle simply consumed them. A Burmese survivor, U Tin Maung, interviewed in 1947 by British war crimes investigators, described Ramusha conditions at a camp near Tambaya. We were brought from Moulmein in trucks, told we would build a railway for 3 months, then return home with payment. There was no payment, no return. Men who could not work were beaten until they worked or died. I saw a Japanese guard beat a man who had collapsed, beat him for 10 minutes with a bamboo pole until the man was dead, then order the body thrown into the river. This was considered normal. We lost perhaps half our group. I do not know the exact number because we were never counted, just worked until we could not work, then replaced. The engineering specifications for the completed railway, assessed by British engineering officers after Japanese surrender in 1945, revealed a structure barely functional and ultimately useless for its intended purpose. Track consisted of light rail, 60 pounds per yard, originally laid in Java and pulled up for reuse in Burma. The rail was worn, showing stress fractures and dimensional irregularities that made safe operations at normal speeds impossible. Rail joints were uneven because Japanese engineers lacked proper rail saws and simply cut rail with hacksaws, producing rough ends that created dangerous gaps. Ties were hardwood cut from local forests and laid untreated directly on ballast. Without chemical treatment, tropical insects and rot destroyed tie integrity within months. Post-war British inspection found 40% of ties in advanced decay, requiring immediate replacement for continued operations. Ballast was river gravel, hand-carried and dumped without proper grading. It provided inadequate support and drainage, causing track settlement and washouts during monsoons. Track gauge measured 1,000 millimetres, metre gauge, standard for Thai and Burmese colonial railways, but incompatible with Japan's 1,067 millimetre gauge. This meant cargo had to be transshipped at both ends, requiring additional handling that eliminated speed advantages. The track alignment violated basic railway engineering principles. Grades exceeded 3% in multiple sections, requiring locomotives to operate at maximum power and limiting cargo capacity. Curves reached 12 degrees, considered dangerously sharp for anything except mining railways, forcing speed restrictions to 8 miles per hour. The combination of sharp curves and steep grades on wooden bridges created conditions where locomotive derailments occurred regularly. British engineers examining the route in 1945 calculated that maximum safe operating speed for the entire route was 15 miles per hour average, producing a theoretical transit time of 17 hours for the 250-mile journey. This assumed no delays for passing, no breakdowns, perfect track conditions, and ideal weather. In practice, Japanese military records show average transit times exceeding 30 hours, with frequent multi-day delays for repairs and bridge reconstructions. The railway's actual logistics capacity, measured during its brief operational period from October 1943 through July 1945, never approached Japanese requirements. Colonel Banno Hiroshi, Railway Operations Officer for Burma Area Army, maintained detailed logs recovered from Japanese archives after the war. These logs provide definitive evidence that the railway failed completely as a logistics solution. In October 1943, the first full month of operations, the railway moved 1,847 tons of supplies northward to Burma, averaging 60 tons per train, over 31 train movements. This represented approximately 6% of monthly requirements for Burma Area Army forces. In January 1944, after 3 months of operations, monthly tonnage increased to 2,314 tons over 43 train movements. This represented 7.7% of monthly requirements. The improvement came not from increased capacity, but from reducing cargo elsewhere to concentrate on the railway. In April 1944, during the Imphal offensive, when Japanese forces in Burma required maximum supply support, the railway moved 3,092 tons over 67 train movements. This represented 10.3% of monthly requirements during Japan's most critical Burma operation. Without supplies that should have come via the railway, Japanese forces at Imphal and Kohima starved. Lieutenant Takahashi Taro, supply officer for the 31st Division, recorded in his diary, before dying of malnutrition, that his division had received no rice shipments for 14 days, no ammunition for 22 days, no medical supplies for 38 days. The railway was supposed to solve this. Instead, we watched trains derail and bridges collapse while we starved. The railway's theoretical maximum capacity, calculated by British engineers assessing the line in 1945, was approximately 1,800 tons per day, assuming continuous operations with perfect maintenance. This would have required 15 trains daily, each carrying 120 tons, completing the journey in 18 hours, with perfect coordination at transshipment points. The Japanese never achieved anything approaching this capacity. Operational problems compounded continuously. Locomotives, primarily Class C 56 tank engines, weighing 48 tons and producing 550 horsepower, were too heavy for the light rail and weak bridges. Repeated derailments damaged both locomotives and track, requiring repairs that consumed time and resources. Rolling stock consisted of captured British and Thai freight wagons, most in poor condition and lacking maintenance. Cargo capacity averaged 8 tons per wagon, far below the 20-ton standard for normal railways, because damaged suspension and brakes limited safe loading. Bridges collapsed regularly under train loads. Japanese engineering logs document 14 major bridge failures between October 1943 and December 1944, each requiring complete reconstruction and creating delays lasting weeks. Track washouts during monsoon season closed the railway completely for 74 days between June and September 1944. Repair crews, consisting of impressed local labour and surviving prisoners, could not work during heavy rain, so damaged sections simply remained closed until weather improved. Allied bombing, beginning in April 1944, after Allied codebreakers identified the railway as critical infrastructure, destroyed track, bridges, and rolling stock faster than Japanese forces could repair them. The bridge at Thamay Kam was bombed 6 times between February and June 1945, remaining operational for a total of 23 days during that period. Japanese strategic planning documents captured in Burma and analysed by British intelligence in 1945 reveal that Tokyo knew the railway was failing but could not admit it. A Southern Army logistics assessment from June 1944, marked most secret and recovered from headquarters in Rangoon, stated that Burma Area Army required 10,000 tons of supplies monthly to maintain defensive positions. Current supply delivery via all routes, including the railway, sea convoys, and air transport, totaled 2,700 tons monthly. The assessment concluded that unless supply delivery increased by 370% within 3 months, Japanese forces in Burma would collapse from starvation and ammunition exhaustion, regardless of enemy military action. The assessment's recommendations included abandoning outlying positions to concentrate forces near supply lines, reducing troop strength through involuntary attrition, which meant allowing soldiers to starve, and accepting that Burma could not be held beyond 1945. The recommendations were rejected. Instead, Tokyo ordered renewed efforts to increase railway capacity through more intensive maintenance and additional labor mobilization. The additional labor came from Japanese soldiers in Burma, who were diverted from combat roles to railway repair work. This weakened defensive positions while failing to improve railway performance because soldiers had no engineering training and even fewer resources than original construction crews. Lieutenant Fukuda Masao, assigned to railway maintenance duty in March 1945, described the futility in his diary. "We repair track that enemy bombers destroy the next day. We rebuild bridges with materials we cut from the jungle using hand saws. We have no heavy equipment, no spare parts, no replacement rail. When a locomotive breaks down, which happens constantly, we cannibalize parts from other locomotives until we have one working engine instead of 3. This is not logistics. This is the death throes of an army that has already lost." The railway's final operational statistics, compiled after the war by the Allied translator and interpreter section from captured Japanese documents, provided mathematical proof of the project's complete failure. Total construction cost, measured in Japanese yen at 1943 exchange rates, exceeded 2.5 billion yen, equivalent to approximately $625 million in 1943 currency. This represented 1/3 of Japan's entire military construction budget for 1943. For comparison, the US Army Corps of Engineers built the Alaska Highway, 1,700 miles of all-weather road through mountainous wilderness, in 8 months for $138 million. Total tonnage moved during operational period, October 1943 through August 1945, was approximately 98,000 tons. This averaged 4,300 tons monthly, requiring 10,000 tons daily, meant the railway operated at 1.4% of required capacity. Cost per ton delivered was 25,510 yen, approximately $6,377 per ton in 1943 currency. For comparison, shipping cargo from San Francisco to Brisbane, Australia, a 7,400-mile sea voyage through submarine-infested waters, cost the US military approximately $18 per ton, including convoy protection. The Japanese paid 354 times more to move supplies 250 miles overland than Americans paid to ship supplies across the Pacific. Human cost per ton delivered was 1.02 deaths per ton moved, calculated from total deaths of 100,000 and total tonnage of 98,000. This ratio, unique in military logistics history, represented the cost of attempting continental operations without continental logistics capacity. Return on investment, measured as military value gained versus resources expended, was negative. The railway consumed resources, labor, materials, and time that could have been used for legitimate military operations, while delivering insufficient supplies to meaningfully affect Burma campaign outcomes. The Japanese perspective on the railway's failure appears in post-war interrogations of senior officers conducted by the US Strategic Bombing Survey and British interrogation teams. Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe, commanding Burma Area Army from March 1943 through August 1944, testified in October 1945 that the railway was an engineering impossibility from conception. In April 1943, I submitted a report to Southern Army stating that the railway could not meet supply requirements even if completed on schedule. I recommended abandoning further construction and instead concentrating resources on defending Rangoon Port, which, despite submarine attacks, delivered more supplies than the railway ever would. My recommendations were rejected with criticism that I lacked fighting spirit. The railway continued consuming resources while my forces starved. Lieutenant General Heitaro Kimura, commanding Burma Area Army from August 1944 through surrender, testified in November 1945 about the railway's final months. By January 1945, the railway was non-functional for weeks at a time. Allied bombing destroyed bridges faster than we could repair them. The remaining locomotives were breaking down from overuse and lack of maintenance. We had no spare parts, no replacement rail, no skilled maintenance personnel. I requested permission to dismantle the railway and salvage the rail for use in defensive fortifications, where steel was desperately needed. Permission was denied because admitting the railway's failure meant admitting that 100,000 people died for nothing. Colonel Yoshitada Nagatomo, chief railway engineer who had predicted the project's failure in 1942, survived the war and testified at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in 1946. He stated that when he submitted his initial survey recommending against construction, he was told that expressing doubt about the railway's success was tantamount to defeatism. Technical objections were dismissed as lack of confidence in Japanese engineering spirit. I knew the railway would fail. Every engineer who reviewed the plan knew it would fail. But in 1942, Japan, saying a project was impossible for technical reasons was considered cowardice. So we built it anyway, killed 100,000 people, accomplished nothing. And now I sit here explaining why I followed orders to do something I knew was wrong. His testimony, delivered without emotion or excuse, captured the essential tragedy of the Burma Railway. The Allied bombing campaign against the railway, beginning in April 1944 after RAF and USAAF intelligence identified it as critical infrastructure, demonstrated that even if the railway had worked, it would have been quickly destroyed. Operation Burning, the code name for strikes against the Burma-Siam Railway, involved 14 bomber squadrons flying from bases in India and Ceylon. Between April 1944 and July 1945, Allied aircraft flew approximately 4,500 sorties against railway targets, dropping 8,200 tons of bombs. The bombing campaign's effectiveness was enhanced by ultra-intelligence, decrypted Japanese communications that revealed exactly which bridges and sections were most critical. British intelligence knew from Japanese railway traffic messages that certain bridges, particularly those at Thame Kam and Tamarkan, carried 70% of all traffic. Concentrating attacks on these choke points maximized disruption while minimizing sortie requirements. The Japanese response illustrated their logistics bankruptcy. They had insufficient anti-aircraft artillery to defend the entire 250-mile route, so they concentrated defenses at major bridges. This made those bridges obvious targets which Allied intelligence already knew were critical. They attempted night repair operations to minimize bomb damage, but lacked lighting equipment, so work proceeded slowly by moonlight and torchlight. They tried camouflaging bridges with vegetation, but Allied reconnaissance photography easily penetrated this. They attempted building bypass routes around bombed sections, but lacked equipment and labour to construct them effectively. Squadron leader Arthur Dwight of 159 Squadron RAF, flying Liberator bombers from Digri, India, described strikes against the Thame Kam Bridge in June 1945. We hit that bridge 6 times in 4 months. Every time they rebuilt it within days using timber cut from the jungle and forced labour. We'd return 2 weeks later and bomb it again. Eventually, we were bombing rubble. The bridge was more wreckage than structure, but trains somehow still crossed it, at walking pace, until our last strike completely destroyed the approaches. It was futile for them and wasteful for us, but the railway had assumed such symbolic importance that neither side could abandon it. The railway's post-war fate demonstrated its fundamental uselessness. When British forces reoccupied Burma in May 1945, military engineers assessed the railway for possible continued use. Their report, filed in July 1945 and stored in the National Archives in London, recommended complete abandonment. The track was worn beyond serviceability, and would require replacement of 80% of rail. The bridges were structurally unsound and would require complete reconstruction using modern materials and techniques. The route alignment violated modern safety standards and would require extensive rerouting to reduce grades and curves. The maintenance requirements would exceed operational value for any civilian or military purpose. Estimated cost to bring the railway to minimal safety standards exceeded original construction cost. British military authorities ordered the Thai section from Nong Pladuk to Three Pagodas Pass, maintained for occupation forces supply. The Burma section from Three Pagodas Pass to Thanbuzayat was abandoned immediately and salvaged for scrap metal needed for reconstruction efforts. In 1947, the Thai section south of Kanchanaburi was restored to limited civilian service, operating at speeds not exceeding 25 miles per hour. The section north of Kanchanaburi to Three Pagodas Pass was abandoned in 1949 when the Thai government determined that maintenance costs exceeded any economic benefit. The Burmese section was completely abandoned by British occupation authorities and gradually consumed by jungle. Modern satellite imagery shows no trace of most of the Burmese route. The jungle reclaimed in 5 years what had cost 100,000 lives to build. Today, a 48-mile section from Nong Pladuk to Nam Tok operates as a tourist railway. Visitors ride diesel locomotives across the Tha Mai Kham Bridge, rebuilt in concrete after the war, and view cemeteries where Allied prisoners are buried. The railway generates approximately 50 million baht annually in tourism revenue, finally providing economic value 80 years after construction. The Burma Railway's legacy extends beyond the immediate tragedy of 100,000 deaths and total strategic failure. It represents the catastrophic consequences of divorcing military planning from engineering reality, of prioritizing political objectives over logistical feasibility, and of treating human life as an infinite resource that can compensate for absent equipment and expertise. The railway demonstrated principles that remain relevant for understanding military logistics in any era. First, distance and terrain impose costs that cannot be overcome through willpower or forced labour. The 250 miles between Thailand and Burma included obstacles that required modern equipment to cross efficiently. Without that equipment, the obstacles simply killed workers without being meaningfully overcome. Second, infrastructure maintenance consumes resources that often exceed initial construction costs. Japanese planners allocated resources for building the railway, but none for maintaining it in monsoon climate. The predictable result was continuous collapse and reconstruction. Third, logistics capacity determines strategic possibility. Japan's Burma campaign required 10,000 tons of supplies daily. The railway could move 1,000 tons on perfect days and averaged far less. This gap could not be bridged through tactical brilliance or fighting spirit. Fourth, treating human beings as expendable resources produces neither economic efficiency nor military effectiveness. The 100,000 deaths represented not just moral catastrophe, but logistics failure. Dead workers produce no value, require disposal, spread disease, demoralize survivors, and must be replaced, consuming additional resources for transport and imprisonment. An army that kills its workforce is an army that has already lost. The Japanese military's refusal to accept these principles led directly to the railway's failure and contributed to broader strategic defeat. By late 1944, when Burma Area Army collapsed at Imphal and Kohima, Japanese forces were losing, not because they were outfought, but because they were outsupplied. American and British logistics delivered 500,000 tons of supplies monthly to forces in Burma and China, moving cargo through modern ports on maintained roads using truck fleets exceeding 100,000 vehicles. Japan's most ambitious logistics project, which killed 100,000 people, delivered 4,300 tons monthly and absorbed resources that could have been used effectively elsewhere. The recognition of the railway's victims came slowly and remains incomplete. Allied prisoners who survived returned home to nations that initially suppressed their stories. British and Australian governments, eager to move past the war and concerned about affecting relations with Japan, discouraged public discussion of POW mistreatment. Veterans faced skepticism about their accounts, with newspaper editors and even fellow veterans questioning whether conditions were really that bad. The Romusha received no recognition at all for decades. Asian labourers, conscripted from colonised territories, had no governments to advocate for them, no veterans' organisations to preserve their memory, and often no surviving family members to tell their stories. They existed in historical records primarily as statistics, if they existed at all. The first major recognition came in 1957 when David Lean's film The Bridge on the River Kwai brought worldwide attention to the railway's story, albeit in heavily fictionalised form. The film's depiction of British Colonel Nicholson collaborating enthusiastically with Japanese captors enraged actual survivors who pointed out that collaboration meant death in real camps, but the film created public awareness that ultimately enabled veterans to share their actual experiences. In 1962, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission completed Kanchanaburi War Cemetery, where 6,982 Allied prisoners are buried. The Netherlands established Chung Kai War Cemetery for 1,740 Dutch prisoners. These cemeteries provide permanent recognition for Allied victims, maintained with proper respect. No equivalent memorial exists for the Romusha. Estimates place their burial locations as scattered work camps along the route, mass graves in jungle clearings, or simply wherever they fell. The Thai and Burmese governments have never attempted comprehensive location or identification of Romusha remains. In 2004, the Burma Railway Memorial in Kanchanaburi was expanded to include recognition of Asian labourers. The memorial lists names of 6,982 identified Allied prisoners, but acknowledges approximately 90,000 unidentified Romusha with a single plaque. The disparity reflects uncomfortable historical reality. Colonial powers maintain memorials for their citizens. Colonized peoples remain statistical abstractions. Japanese officers responsible for the railway's construction and the deaths it caused faced limited accountability. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal prosecuted 41 individuals directly connected to Burma railway operations between 1946 and 1948. Of these, 32 were convicted, 5 were executed, and 27 received prison sentences ranging from 5 years to life. Lieutenant General Shojiro Ida, who commanded Japanese forces during initial railway planning, was convicted and executed in 1946 for broader war crimes beyond the railway. His execution was for ordering massacres of civilians, not for railway construction deaths. Colonel Yoshitada Nagatomo, the chief engineer who predicted the project's failure, testified at tribunals but was never charged. His role as engineering advisor rather than command officer apparently exempted him from responsibility, despite his direct involvement in construction supervision. Guards and labor supervisors received harsher treatment than senior officers. Sergeant Katsuo Nakamura, whose diary documented casual brutality, was convicted and executed in 1947. Dozens of junior officers and guards received similar sentences for direct acts of violence against prisoners. The disparity illustrated a pattern seen throughout post-war justice, where those who conceived disasters escaped accountability, while those who implemented them faced execution. The war crimes trials did establish legal precedent that military officers could be held responsible for logistics operations that violated laws of war. The precedent established that claiming technical necessity did not excuse enslaving prisoners for military construction or providing conditions that predictably caused mass death. These principles, established through Burma railway prosecutions, influenced later military law and the Geneva Convention's revisions of 1949. The engineering lessons learned from the railway's failure influenced post-war military logistics, thinking in unexpected ways. The US Army Corps of Engineers studied Japanese railway construction as a case study in what not to do, creating training documents that circulated widely through engineering schools. Key lessons identified included the necessity of matching project scope to available resources, the importance of proper geological surveying before beginning construction, the requirement to calculate maintenance costs as thoroughly as construction costs, and the principle that forced labour produces inferior results compared to paid skilled workers. British military engineering incorporated Burma Railway lessons into doctrine about tropical construction. Post-war manuals on jungle engineering operations specifically cited the railway's failures, noting that monsoon climate requires different techniques than temperate construction, and that indigenous labour must be properly fed, housed, and equipped to be effective. The Burma Railway influenced post-war reconstruction philosophy in Southeast Asia. When Thailand began developing its northeastern region in the 1950s, engineers deliberately avoided the railway's mistakes, conducting thorough surveys, using modern equipment, properly compensating workers, and accepting slower timelines that matched available resources. The contrast between careful post-war development and wartime desperation demonstrated that what Japan claimed was impossible with proper methods was indeed impossible with improper methods. The railway stands today as a monument to the futility of attempting modern warfare without modern logistics capacity. Its 250 miles of track, built with such terrible human cost, delivered supplies for barely 2 years before being abandoned as worthless. The 100,000 deaths it caused brought Japan nothing but confirmation that industrial warfare requires industrial logistics, that engineering reality cannot be overcome through ideology, and that treating human beings as expendable resources produces neither military nor moral victory. The prisoners who survived carried memories of the railway until their deaths. Tom Morris, Australian prisoner who worked on the Connew cutting, said in a 1985 interview that every railway bridge he crosses reminds him of the one he built with hand tools while dying of malaria. The railway taught me that human beings are capable of both extraordinary endurance and extraordinary cruelty, that survival sometimes requires becoming someone you don't recognize, and that the worst torture isn't physical pain, but watching your friends die knowing their deaths accomplished nothing. The Ramusha who survived, those few who returned to their villages in Burma, Thailand and Malaya, rarely spoke of their experiences. They had no veterans organizations, no government recognition, no public platform for their stories. They simply returned to subsistence farming or manual labor, carrying memories that had no place in post-war societies eager to forget. The railway itself, that 250-mile line through mountains and jungle, mostly vanished within a decade. The jungle reclaimed what could be reclaimed. The bridges collapsed without maintenance. The track was pulled up for scrap metal. Nature erased in 10 years what had cost 100,000 lives to create. But the lessons remained, inscribed in military logistics doctrine, in engineering textbooks, in war crimes precedent, in the graveyards scattered along the route. The lesson that distance matters, that terrain imposes costs, that equipment cannot be replaced by willpower, that logistics determines strategy, and that human life cannot be treated as an infinite resource to compensate for industrial inadequacy. Japan learned these lessons in the jungles of Burma and Thailand, paid for them with 100,000 deaths, and received nothing in return but confirmation that they were fighting a war their logistics could never win. The Burma Railway killed 100,000 people, operated for 2 years, moved 98,000 tons of supplies, cost 2.5 billion yen, and accomplished nothing except demonstrating that modern warfare requires modern logistics and that attempting it without such logistics produces only corpses and failure. The mathematics were clear from the beginning. Japan needed 10,000 tons daily. The railway delivered 1,000 tons on perfect days and averaged far less. No amount of forced labour, no quantity of deaths, no expenditure of resources could bridge that gap. The railway failed not because it was poorly built, though it was, but because it was attempting to solve a problem that required industrial solutions with pre-industrial methods. In the end, the Burma Railway stands not as testament to Japanese engineering or Allied suffering, though it was both, but as proof that in modern war, arithmetic matters more than courage, logistics matter more than tactics, and that any nation attempting continental operations without continental logistics capacity has already lost, regardless of how many people it kills trying to prove otherwise.